The rain fell soft and persistent against the tall windows of Buckingham Palace, blurring the London skyline into a watercolor of gray. Inside, the atmosphere was far more turbulent than the weather outside. King Charles III sat behind the resolute desk that had belonged to his mother, and her father before her. The wood was polished to a gleam, but the weight of history pressing down upon it was immense. Before him lay not state papers, but a collection of hastily compiled reports and grainy photographs, documenting a moment that had already sparked 1,000 headlines. The image was clear. His wife, Queen Camilla, and his daughter-in-law, the Princess of Wales, standing with Donald and Melania Trump during the recent state visit. In one frame, Camilla's hand appeared to gesture, and in the next, Kate took a small step back. The internet had erupted, accusing the Queen of pushing the future Queen aside, of a petty slight caught on camera for the world to see. For Charles, it was more than just a public relations disaster. It was a crack in the facade of unity he was desperately trying to maintain. His reign, begun under the shadow of his mother's passing, was supposed to be about modernization and streamlining the monarchy. Instead, it was beset by the lingering scandal surrounding his brother, Andrew, the constant transatlantic barrage from his son, Harry, and now a very visible rift between the two most important women in his life. He ran a hand over his face, the flesh beneath his eyes heavy with fatigue. He knew Camilla well enough to understand her gesture was likely a clumsy attempt at protocol, a misjudged moment rather than a malicious act. But he also knew Kate. He saw the quiet dignity with which she carried herself, the genuine warmth the public felt for her, and the steely determination she shared with his son, William. The footage didn't lie about the result. Kate had been made to look secondary, pushed aside at a moment when all the world was watching. His thoughts drifted back to a conversation he had shared with Kate just weeks earlier. He had been undergoing treatment for cancer, a deeply personal and frightening battle fought largely away from the cameras. Kate, who was navigating her own health scare with a grace that left him in awe, had visited him at Highgrove. They had sat in his beloved garden, the scent of lavender and rosemary hanging in the air, and spoken not as monarch and princess, but as a father-in-law and the woman who would one day be his successor's queen. She had spoken of her children, of her fears, and of her unwavering commitment to William and the future of the institution. He had seen in her eyes a reflection of his own sense of duty, a quiet strength that reminded him of his grandmother, the Queen Mother. He had told her then, in that private moment, that she was the future. Now he had the chance to prove it. Charles knew that the old ways of doing things, the silent endurance, the palace denials, the hope that the storm would simply pass, were no longer viable in the age of instant virality. A decision was required, a dramatic one. He thought of the royal collection, the breathtaking archive of jewels, some so heavy with history they felt like they were made of significance rather than metal and stone. The access to the most precious of these had always been tightly controlled, a privilege often managed by the queen consort. Camilla had her favorites, pieces that she felt suited her style and station. Kate, despite her position as the Princess of Wales, had often been loaned pieces, but the ultimate authority, the key to the vault, was not hers to command. That evening he summoned his private secretary. The instruction was clear, concise, and absolute. An official note would be drafted, its wording carefully chosen to avoid direct confrontation while leaving no room for misinterpretation. The Princess of Wales was to be granted full, unfettered access to the royal jewelry collection. Any piece she wished to borrow for official state duties, for tours, for any engagement that served the crown, and was to be made available to her without question or delay. The authority was no longer to be filtered. It was a direct order from the king. The news, when it leaked, as palace news always does, sent a shock wave through the household. It was a vote of confidence so public, so tangible, that it could not be ignored. It was not just about diamonds and sapphires. It was about trust, about visibility, and about the future. Charles had effectively placed the most dazzling symbols of royal power into the hands of his daughter-in-law, signaling to Camilla, to the court, and to the world that in the battle for the monarchy's future, Kate Middleton was his chosen champion. It was a breathtaking move, one that would redefine the dynamics of the palace for years to come. He leaned back in his chair, the decision made, the course set. The rain continued to fall, but inside the palace a new line had been drawn in the sand. The silence in the Queen's sitting room was thick enough to be cut with a knife. Camilla Parker Bowles, now Queen of the United Kingdom, sat perfectly still, her hands folded in her lap. Before her, on a delicate side table, lay a copy of the court circular, but her eyes were fixed on a point far beyond the gilded walls of her private apartment. The news of her husband's decree had reached her within hours, delivered not by Charles himself, but by a tight-lipped lady-in-waiting who had heard it from a whispering undersecretary. The humiliation was not in the act itself, but in the method. He had not discussed it with her. He had not warned her. He had simply decided, and in doing so, had publicly clipped her wings. The memory of the state visit, at the moment that had apparently triggered this seismic shift, replayed in her mind with an irritating clarity. It had been a fleeting thing. The trumps were moving, the carriages were approaching, and protocol dictated a specific choreography of movement. Her gesture had been one of direction, not dismissal. But the cameras, those ever-hungry lenses, had captured a different story. They had seen a queen asserting dominance, pushing the younger woman aside. They had chosen to see a rivalry, and now that imagined rivalry had been given the weight of royal policy by her own husband. This was not the first time Camilla had felt the sting of comparison. Her entire life in the public eye had been a masterclass in endurance. For decades, she had been cast as the villain in a tragic fairy tale, the other woman who had broken the heart of the nation's beloved princess, Diana. She had weathered storms of vitriol that would have capsized anyone else, her skin thickening with each cruel headline. She had waited, with a patience that was almost pathological, for her moment of acceptance. And slowly, painstakingly, it had come. The Queen had blessed their union, the public had softened, and finally she had taken her place as Charles's queen consort. She had earned her place, not through birth or youthful beauty, but through loyalty, humor, and an unshakable love for a man she had known for most of her life. And now, this. A new princess, young, beautiful, and adored, was being handed the very tools of royal glamour that Camilla had only recently been allowed to wield without controversy. Kate's popularity so effortlessly won, and was a constant, silent rebuke to the decades of struggle Camilla had endured. The insiders were right when they whispered that Camilla had never quite pictured Kate as the one to carry the crown forward. It wasn't personal, not entirely. It was about the narrative. Camilla's story was one of redemption through perseverance. Kate's story was one of seamless ascension. Now Charles, in his wisdom, was accelerating that ascension, effectively casting Camilla as a supporting actress on a stage where she had fought so hard to become a lead. The whispers from her own circle were pointed. "It's a slight," they murmured. "He's publicly humiliated you for the sake of popularity." The word popularity stung more than any insult. It suggested that her value was transactional, and that her decades of devotion were worth less than the public's adoration for a smiling face in a magazine. She thought of her own children, Tom and Laura, and the quiet, unassuming lives they led, far from this gilded cage of constant judgment. She thought of the Middletons, Kate's family, and the rumors that had once circulated about Camilla making them use the servants' entrance. It all felt so petty now, so beneath the dignity of a queen, Yet the dignity was all she had left. To rage, to protest, would be to prove the narrative true. It would paint her as the jealous older queen, resentful of the young pretender. She could not win that battle, not in the press, not in the court of public opinion. So she sat, her face a mask of serene composure, even as a cold fury settled in her bones. The king had made his choice. And he had legitimized Kate's future role in the most spectacular way possible. From now on, every time Kate appeared at a state banquet wearing the legendary Cambridge Lover's Knot tiara or the Nizam of Hyderabad necklace, it would be a reminder of this moment. It would be a reminder that the king had taken a side, and it was not hers. The battle for influence within the palace had just entered a new, more dangerous phase, and Camilla understood, with a clarity that was both painful and empowering, that she was now standing on ground that was no longer entirely her own. In the tranquility of Adelaide Cottage, their home on the Windsor estate, the news was received with a very different kind of emotion. For Catherine, Princess of Wales, the king's decree was a thunderbolt of validation. She stood in the kitchen, a simple space where she often prepared breakfast for George, Charlotte, and Louis, a mug of tea forgotten and growing cold in her hands as William read the official communication aloud. When he finished, he looked up at her, a rare smile of genuine, unfiltered pride breaking through the usual guarded expression he wore like armor. "Well," he said, his voice thick with meaning. "That's that, then." Kate felt a prickle of tears behind her eyes, a wave of emotion she quickly suppressed. The past few years had been a brutal test of her resilience. She had endured the cruel taunts of weighty Katie in her youth, the relentless scrutiny of her family, and the suffocating pressure of joining an institution that swallowed people whole. More recently, she had faced her own mortality with a cancer diagnosis, a enduring treatment while trying to maintain a sense of normalcy for her children, all under the merciless gaze of the world's media. Through it all, she had learned to build walls, to find strength in silence, and to draw courage from the small, warm circle of her family. William was her rock, but the monarchy had often felt like a cold, distant fortress. This gesture from the king felt different. It wasn't a duty or an obligation. It was a choice, a personal, powerful choice made by a man who understood the weight of the crown better than anyone. She remembered that quiet afternoon at Highgrove, the vulnerability in his eyes as he spoke of his own illness, the shared understanding of two people fighting battles the public would never fully comprehend. He had looked at her not just as a princess, but as an equal, and a fellow soldier in the fight for the future of their family's legacy. "You are the future," he had said. Now he had given the world a sign that he meant it. The implications were staggering. The royal jewels were more than just beautiful objects. They were the visual language of monarchy. They signified power, continuity, and status. When the queen wore them, she was the embodiment of the state. When the late Princess Diana wore them, she became a global icon, a figure of light and tragedy. For Kate, access to this treasure trove meant she could now curate her own image with the most potent tools available. It meant that on her next state visit, she could stand beside any world leader not just as a pretty princess, but as a representative of royal power draped in the diamonds of her predecessors. But more than the public role, but it was the private message that resonated most deeply. It was a shield. It told the whispering courtiers and the Camilla-aligned factions that she had the king's absolute confidence. No longer would she have to navigate the subtle slights, the veiled comments about her common background, or the quiet resistance to her growing influence. Charles had legitimized that influence, wrapping it in the glittering armor of royal tradition. He had, in one dramatic move, anointed her as his partner in the project of securing the monarchy's future. As she finally lifted the cold mug to her lips, she caught William's eye. The tension that had been a constant companion for months seemed to ease, just a fraction. This was a victory, not over Camilla, but for them. It was a sign that the king saw what the public saw, a partnership of strength and of love and of unwavering duty. That night, as she tucked her children into bed, she kissed their foreheads and whispered a silent promise. She would wear those jewels. She would stand on those world stages, and she would honor the trust the king had placed in her. She would do it for her family, for her country, and for the quiet, determined hope that one day her own daughter might understand what it meant to be given a chance to shine. The king's decree, however, did not settle the palace. It merely changed the nature of its currents. The unease that had simmered beneath the surface now bubbled into the open, a silent but palpable tension that followed Kate through the corridors. The invitation was extended, and with the king's blessing, she accepted. It was a bold, an unexpected move that left the palace reeling and further widened the gulf between her and the queen. Kate decided to reach out to the one person who had become a ghost in the family portrait, Prince Harry. For months, Kate had watched the estrangement with a heavy heart. She understood William's anger and his sense of betrayal. She had seen the pain in his eyes when Harry's memoir, Spare, had been published, laying bare the most intimate and painful details of their shared history. She knew that Camilla's camp had fully supported William's zero-tolerance policy towards his brother, viewing Harry's attacks on the Queen, whom he had famously labeled a wicked stepmother, as unforgivable. It was a hard line, a wall of silence designed to protect the institution and the king. But Kate also remembered something else. And she remembered the laughter. She remembered the early days of her relationship with William, when Harry was not a threat, but a beloved younger brother, a mischievous presence who brought lightness to the often stuffy royal events. She remembered the shared grief after the loss of their mother, Diana, a bond that should have been unbreakable. She saw in her own children, George, Charlotte, and Louis, the precious gift of sibling bonds, and couldn't bear the thought of them one day being as estranged as their father and his brother. The rift was a cancer, and she believed, with a conviction that bordered on naivety, that it needed to be cured, not just contained. While William was publicly supporting the king's stance and privately seething, Kate began a quiet, almost clandestine campaign. Through back channels, using trusted aides who had maintained contact with Harry's dwindling UK-based team, a message was sent. It was simple, warm, and utterly disarming. It spoke of family, of forgiveness, and of the king's failing health. It bypassed the lawyers and the PR teams and appealed directly to the human being she remembered. The result was the private tea at Clarence House that would send shockwaves through the monarchy. Harry, during a fleeting visit to the UK for a charity event, slipped away from his security detail and met with his father. The meeting, carefully orchestrated away from the official residence where Camilla was present, was described by insiders as delightful and positive. For the first time in years, father and son spoke not as monarch and exiled prince, but as a parent and child navigating the wreckage of their relationship. When Camilla learned of the meeting, and more importantly, of Kate's role in facilitating it, her fury was absolute. The cold resentment she had felt over the jewels now ignited into a burning anger. She confronted Kate in a private room after a family church service at Sandringham. Her voice, usually a low, gravelly purr, was sharp with indignation. She accused Kate of being naive and reckless, of undermining the king's health with unnecessary stress, and of betraying William's trust. She could not believe that Kate was continuing to stick up for Harry after everything he said, framing the act not as one of compassion, but as a dangerous interference in matters she didn't understand. Kate stood her ground, her own voice quiet but firm. She spoke of family, as of the importance of healing, of a father's love for his son. She said that she understood Camilla's anger, but that she believed in the possibility of redemption, a concept the Queen herself should understand better than most, given her own journey into the family's good graces. The words hung in the air, a pointed and undeniable comparison. Camilla fell silent, her face a mask of stone. The conversation was over, but the war had been redefined. Kate had not only claimed the jewels, she had dared to meddle in the most painful family dynamic of all. In doing so, she had shown that her vision for the future of this family was vastly different from the Queen's, and she was willing to fight for it, even if it meant standing alone. The fallout from the Clarence House tea was immediate and severe. The fragile peace that had existed, that a tense truce built on mutual avoidance, had been shattered. King Charles, while privately touched by the meeting with his son, was now caught in the crossfire between his wife and his daughter-in-law. He retreated further into his duties and his health regimen, the stress of the situation a palpable weight on his already burdened shoulders. For Prince William, the news was a profound betrayal. William had spent years building a fortress around his family. He had watched his mother's life unravel in the full glare of the media, and he had sworn an oath to himself that his children would be protected from that same destructive force. Harry's departure, his interviews, his book, it all felt like a sustained assault on that fortress, a public airing of grievances that invited the very scrutiny William despised. And he had dealt with it by building a wall of silence and cold indifference. It was his coping mechanism, his armor, and now his wife, his partner, his safe harbor, had taken a sledgehammer to it. The argument that followed, away from the children and behind the closed doors of their home, was the most intense of their marriage. William's temper, a trait well documented by palace insiders who spoke of his mood swings and a fuse that could be measured in millimeters, was on full display. He paced the room, his voice a low, furious growl that was more terrifying than a shout. He spoke of loyalty, of trust, of the years of pain Harry had caused. He accused her of undermining him, of going behind his back, of exposing them all to more pain and more scrutiny. Kate, for her part, did not retreat. She met his fury with a calm that was, in its own way, just as powerful. She reminded him that she was not just his wife, but his partner, his equal. She told him that she had not acted to hurt him, but because she loved him, and she loved his family, and she could not stand by and watch it disintegrate. She spoke of their children, and asked him if he wanted them to grow up never knowing their cousin Archie or their cousin Lilibet. She asked him if he wanted the legacy of his parents' generation, divorce, estrangement, bitterness, to be the only legacy he passed on to his own sons and daughter. For a long moment the room was silent save for William's ragged breathing. He looked at his wife, really looked at her, and saw not just the beautiful princess the world adored, but a woman of extraordinary courage and conviction. And he saw that she was willing to risk his anger, to risk the comfort of their own marriage for something she believed in. It was, he realized with a start, the very definition of love. It wasn't just about supporting him, it was about challenging him, about making him a better man, a better brother, a better future king. The tension did not evaporate. The hurt would take time to heal. But in that moment, something shifted. William's rage began to cool, replaced by a grudging respect and a deep, abiding love. He thought of the biography that had just been published, the one that described their relationship as being shaped by hardship and built on perseverance rather than fairy tale dreams. This was the reality of their life. It was hard, messy, and complicated, but it was real. He pulled her into an embrace, not as a prince embracing a princess, but as a man holding on to the woman who had just proven, once again, that she was strong enough to fight for his future, even when he was too angry to fight for it himself. The spring sunshine was weak but welcome as it streamed into the gardens of Clarence House, casting long, gentle shadows across the immaculate lawns. A small private tea had been arranged. It was not a formal state occasion, but something far more delicate, an attempt at a family gathering. King Charles sat in a cushioned chair, a blanket over his knees, looking thinner than he had a year ago, but with a light in his eyes that had been missing for a long time. Across from him, William sat stiffly, his arms crossed, his jaw tight. Beside him, a calming presence was Kate, and a few feet away, looking as uncomfortable as a man could look, stood Prince Harry. It was Kate who had orchestrated this moment, leveraging the fragile bridge she had built. It was her quiet persistence that had convinced William to attend, her gentle reminders of shared history and future possibilities. Camilla had been pointedly excluded, a decision that had caused another storm in the palace, but which Charles, weary of the conflict, had ultimately accepted. This was about the direct line, father and sons. The king's health, still a concern, had provided the urgency, the unspoken understanding that time was a luxury they could no longer afford. The conversation was stilted at first, a minefield of awkward pauses and carefully chosen words. They spoke of inconsequential things, the weather, a polo match Harry had played in, the progress of the gardens. But slowly, inevitably, the conversation deepened. Harry, his voice thick with emotion, spoke of his memories of their mother, memories he feared were fading. He spoke of the pain of leaving, the feeling of being pushed out, the desperate need to protect his own wife and children from the forces he felt had consumed Diana. William listened. For years, he had only heard these stories filtered through the media, twisted by lawyers and publicists. Hearing them directly from his brother's own mouth was different. It didn't excuse the betrayals, the public accusations, the airing of their most private moments, but it provided context. It reminded him of the scared little boy he had once held onto at their mother's funeral, the only other person in the world who truly understood that particular, unique grief. Kate sat slightly apart, watching the two brothers navigate the wreckage of their relationship. She saw the moment William's posture softened, the moment his arms uncrossed. She saw the tear that escaped down Harry's cheek, and she saw the king, her father-in-law, reach out and place a weathered hand over both of theirs, a silent benediction. In that moment, surrounded by the legacy of 1,000 years of history, they were just a family, trying to find a way back to each other. This was the new order. It was not a world where Camilla's rigid protocols or historical grievances held sway. It was a world shaped by Kate's vision of a monarchy that could heal, that could evolve, and that could put family, in its truest and most complicated sense, at its heart. The jewels were on her arm, but the real prize was far greater. She had not pushed Camilla aside. She had, and instead built a bridge to a future where the monarchy was not just an institution, but a family reunited. As the tea grew cold and the spring sun began to dip below the garden wall, the path forward was still uncertain, fraught with pitfalls and the potential for new wounds. But for the first time in years, it was a path they were walking together. The dramatic step the king had taken was never really about diamonds. It was about trust. And in the quiet of that garden, surrounded by the men she loved, Catherine, Princess of Wales, knew that trust had been the most precious jewel of all.